Super. So I'm the Interim Mental Health Champion for Northern Ireland, and in today's webinar, I'm going to be speaking for roughly half an hour on the following topics. I'm going to start with a wee slide about what my role is as Mental Health Champion. I'm going to then be talking about coping during COVID, during the pandemic. And then the third part of it is a wee bit on leadership and growth and how we might want to try and use this time to do some really good stuff and to even grow or flourish ourselves. And that is possible. And we're going to end with a Q&A session. And we're going to try and end, I think, around the 12 o'clock mark. But if we go over, there's no harm as well. We want to try and get as many of your questions in as possible. So keep using the chat function for those questions as we go. Okay, so mental health champion. I thought this was a particularly good analogy. This is an up-to-date photograph of me. I'm like the little octopus, or the big octopus. I've got tentacles in lots of different places. I have three main roles, though. The first role is that of a public advocate. I am the voice of people with lived experience, and also groups who are working on the ground, supporting people with mental health problems or delivering mental health services. So I am an advocate for the population, and it's really important that I hear the views of the population. So that's why the chat that we're doing today is actually so important, and the Q&As and everything's a big part of it. Second part of my role is policy influence. The post was funded through all of the government departments, and I have projects in all of the departments. So for example, I'm working in the mental health framework in schools. I'm also working with the Department for Justice on several mental health projects within the criminal justice system and prisons, and the probation service. And then, of course, with the Department of Health. I've also met communities, infrastructure, all of those things. I'm doing some suicide prevention work with the Department for Communities too. So lots of different roles. But with the Department of Health, this is a particularly opportune time because we have the 10-year mental health strategy that's going out for consultation in December. And I'm actively involved in the design of that strategy and making sure that people's voices are heard and that people get an opportunity to influence the design of the strategy. And when it does go out for consultation, then the people respond to that. So that's a big part of my work, is understanding what it's like for members of the public, and then designing a strategy for world leading services. And of course, my experience as an academic over 20 years means I can bring a lot of other skills, I guess, to that in terms of using the evidence base to design really good services that work for people. And the third part of my role is a network hub role, which is events like this, being part of a broader discussion about mental health, particularly in the time of a pandemic, getting out key messages about how we can look after ourselves and others at this really difficult time, and then putting back messages to the government about how they're doing right now. So again, it's really important that this is quite interactive so that I can get your views on what's working and what's not working so well. Okay, the themes that I'm focusing on for this period are, sorry, prevention and early intervention, really important to young people, early years schools. What happens in our early lives influences our mental health across our lifespan, because it influences how we respond to stress and how well we cope with stress. So getting in there early is really, really important. Suicide prevention, I've done a lot of research on suicide prevention. It's a thing I know a lot about. So suicide prevention continues to be a focus of my role. Children and young people, of course, particularly during the pandemic, have been impacted disproportionately, I would suggest. So they're a key focus too. Drugs and alcohol, very, very important theme as well. We have the alcohol and drug strategy that's also gone out to consultation soon. So I'll have a role in contributing to that and making sure that people respond to that. But it's certainly an issue that has come to the fore during COVID, and it's also an issue for suicide prevention very much too. And finally, of course, service improvement, working to develop world-leading mental health services for the next 10 years. We need that 10-year strategic approach because we need a workforce plan. We don't have enough people trained to provide therapies right now. It's one of the reasons why we're taking a 10-year approach to the service development. But there's lots we're doing straight away, and there's some easy wins there in service improvement areas that we're focusing on for the next few months too. Okay, so first of all, we have a slide here on the mental health impact of COVID, which is what we're here to talk about. And really, I would be suggesting that these are the primary mental health impacts of the COVID infection, and they can be defined as stresses and losses for people. Um, so, the infection itself, there's the prospect of a lonely, painful death. Which is certainly a mental health issue, but has mental health implications for the bereaved as well. And there's the stress of the illness itself and the possibility of being infected by COVID. And that's creating an awful lot of anxiety there. We also have complicated grief and trauma in relatives of the deceased because we don't have those rituals of funerals and wakes in the way that we had prior to this pandemic. And we know that that can lead to mental health problems in the survivors. We have the stress now of long COVID, and that's a new thing. The 1 in 7 people have longer term symptoms that really impact on their work and life and their roles and their ability to function. And that's something that we're really only starting to understand. The neurological impact of COVID can be important as well. There's some evidence that there's a neurological effect, and that needs to be studied in a lot more detail. In fact, some of my colleagues at Queen's are looking at the impact of the infection on brain function and the neurological system. So there may well be additional mental health implications there. And then we have the trauma and pressure on healthcare workers, of course, being with people in their last few days and weeks of life, not being able to provide them with the support of their families, for example, and just the pressure that staff are under is huge, and the risk that they're putting themselves under in order to provide that frontline care to people who are infected, the risk that comes with exposure to the viral load in and of itself. And I'm thinking here about family members, members of my own family who work in the hospital, and friends who've been infected, who've worked in the hospital. This is absolutely huge. And then we have the general impact on the healthcare system, and the fact that if our hospitals are overwhelmed, we won't be able to treat other urgent conditions, and those include mental health conditions. So suppressing this virus, keeping people safe, is the number 1 priority in terms of mental health and the pandemic. In my view, it continues to be that. And we can get angry about the measures that have been taken, but ultimately we need to do everything that we can to reduce the mental health impact of COVID infection and to reduce the stress and the pain and the loss that will come with widespread infection and our health service being overwhelmed. And I think sometimes that message has been lost in the other side of the mental health impact of COVID, which is the mental health impact of restrictions. And normally what I would do, and I forgot, I meant to do it, and then I put up the slide, so forget about it today. But normally I would ask people what they feel are the mental health impact of COVID, and they talk to me about. I did this with students last Monday in this very slot. They talked to me about loneliness and isolation and not being able to meet their friends. And again, these are stressors and these are losses, and they're huge for the people going through them. But I think they're a price that we need to pay to reduce the other range of stresses and losses. And there's lots we can do about the mental health impact of the restrictions. We should do everything we can to avoid them, obviously. But most of these mental health impacts can be mitigated against, and we can help people manage the stress and loss that comes with this. Stress and loss that comes with infection and death is actually much more difficult to mitigate against. So the stress and trauma of job loss, that's massive, and it's associated with suicides actually. So if we get into a situation where we have 100,000 plus job losses, there will be suicides associated with that, and that's a terrible thing. So we need to mitigate against that. We need to provide adequate protection for people. The trauma and the stress of a reduced income is also huge. The stress of having to close your business, even for a short period of time, to lose everything that you've worked for, that's massive. Social isolation and loneliness are very stressful. And again, there's some things that we can do that help with that, but nothing beats that face-to-face contact and hugs and things. So it's really important we get back to that as soon as possible. There are other mental health implications around the missed services for people with mental health problems, and there's data there that shows that people with existing problems are affected more than others right now. So we need to again make sure our health service can cope with all of the demands, so that we don't have to redeploy people from mental health services to other areas. Then the people with physical conditions that haven't been diagnosed, there's been delays in treatments and diagnosis, that's massive as well. And the missed opportunities to support and identify people at high risk. So people in situations of abuse, violence and poverty. And again, there's people living in very, very difficult situations right now as a result of the restrictions, and we're not able to get the help to them. So those are the priority things I think we need to do as community leaders right now, is to try and help with all of those. There's also time critical developmental stages that we need to attend to very, very carefully. So infancy, early years, childhood and adolescence, this is a period of the lifespan, particularly childhood, early years, infancy. We can't really get that back. When we're middle-aged adults, 6 months of brain development's not going to have much of an impact on our functioning, but what happens to us in infancy and in childhood is so important. So we need to be very careful about imposing restrictions that reduce social contact, reduce opportunities for play in that age group, because they will have lifelong implications. And the other age group we really need to consider is our older people. Again, old age is a time critical period in many ways. We want people to flourish in their later years, and we don't want to have to lock people up or be proposing solutions that involve locking up old people or self-isolating older people. That, in my view, is actually barbaric. So whatever we do in terms of restrictions needs to attend to those time critical phases. And then the final point about this is the fact that our population are now engaging in lifestyles and behaviours that are unhelpful, that are ways of managing the stress and loss that they've gone through, but that may well create problems further down the line. And people are using much more alcohol than before. People who have used drugs are using more drugs. They're getting drugs from different places. Sometimes there's a period of detox, involuntary detox, and then different drugs and things. So there's all sorts of difficulties there. And then we've the aggression that is resulting from this, but also the aggression resulting from the anger, and the feeling that our leaders have failed us. So there's a lot of stuff happening there that can have a negative impact on the population. And whilst the COVID infections have been smaller proportion of the population have been subjected to those, the impact of the restrictions have had more of a widespread impact. So there's more people suffering as a result of these stresses and losses, but there's much more I think we can do about this. And our leaders have a really important role in managing these mental health impacts. So what is the data telling us about COVID? I picked one study, but it does represent a lot of the studies that I've seen. Anxiety, this is a study from the University of Glasgow from a fellow Derry person, Rory O'Connor, led this one, and he did a survey of the population across the UK, including some people from Northern Ireland, and asked about mental health at various points during the pandemic. So the graph here on the left hand side, you see my wee arrow, is anxiety symptoms in the first 3 waves of the study now. So these are not the 3 waves of COVID, because we only have really 2 so far. So wave 1 was at the very, very start of the pandemic. Wave 2 was, I think, around April, May, and then wave 3 was later on in the summer, when we were all eating out to help out and we were able to go and see our friends and stuff, and life was very different. So we don't have a current picture of what it's like right now as we enter a second phase of restrictions and a more long term. But this is very, very helpful, because it shows us how the anxiety levels were really high at the start. There were high proportions of the population had high levels of anxiety. So that there is 21% of the population. So 1 in 5 people had clinically significant anxiety at wave 1. And I would say I was one of those people for sure. I couldn't sleep There was days when it was really, really hard to focus on lectures and things I was trying to prepare, and I was getting my life insurance and all sorted out because I had a history of pneumonia, and I thought this was going to get me, and lots of people have had similar experiences. But thankfully, like most people, my anxiety levels went down as the pandemic progressed and as I worked out a way of managing. So wave 2, wave 3, you can see there that the anxiety levels have gone down, but there's still a group of people who are significantly more anxious than they were prior to the pandemic. Now, anxiety can lead to mental health problems. Chronic anxiety is a mental illness. Generalized anxiety disorder is a mental illness. But for most people, this is just a very natural response to a global pandemic. And we need to know the difference between stress and mental illness, and know that most of us can get through periods of extreme stress, even like this. But there are some people who are more at risk. Looking at the depressive symptoms were higher in that first wave there, and they've gone down a bit. But depression is more about our hopes for the future and our view of the future. So anxiety is about that fear, that terror, that constant being on edge. Depression is about how we view ourselves in the future and what our life's going to be like. And sadness about the past and rumination can be all part of that. So we can see depression's gone down, but not to the same extent. And we know there are more people now suffering from depression. But, those depressive symptoms don't mean that you have depression. It just means very naturally that there's that concern and worry about the future. Rory's a suicide prevention expert, and Rory asked some really important questions about suicidal thoughts. And what we found there was that actually, in contrast to the other types of symptoms of anxiety and depression, the suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation actually increased. And that's been a trend. Not many studies have asked about suicide. So the other studies have shown everything going down. But when we talk about suicide and ask people about those thoughts, it goes up. So again, it's evidence that suicide and mental illness are not directly correlated. Suicide is about our hopes, how we view our life, whether or not we think we'll have a meaningful future or meaningful life. Many people die by suicide don't have a significant serious mental illness. They often do it as a response to a life event or life crisis. And the concern is that job losses and the financial implications of the pandemic will plunge people into those crisis situations. And even in the absence of ongoing long-term mental health problems, they may well feel suicidal. Okay, so let's look at age group and gender, because I think these are very important questions too. Some groups are suffering much more than others. And this left-hand side little graph was actually quite surprising for me. This is a graph showing the age groups most affected by suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. And that green line there is the young people, the 18 to 29 years, and they have more suicidal thoughts. More of that age group have suicidal thoughts than the other age groups, and that's continuing to increase, albeit slightly. And we're certainly not saying that everybody's suicidal, but that young group are more prone to suicidal thoughts than the other two groups. The blue group, 30 to 59. Consistent wee rise up there to 10%. Suicidal thoughts are actually quite common. We shouldn't get alarmed at this, but we do know that they translate into actions for a tiny proportion there, and it's worrying that it's the young people and that's increasing. And then our older age group consistently have 60 plus years lower rates of suicidal ideation. That doesn't mean to say they're not suffering. It just means that they're not actually feeling suicidal. So it's still worrying to think that older people are struggling, and that any older person might feel that their life's not worth living. Let's look at gender. Again, men is the blue line and women is the orange line there, and we can see an increase in suicidal ideation for both age groups, or for both genders, for males and females, but women are more impacted than men by suicidal thoughts. So we have 8.6, 9.6, 10% of women there. Wave 3 had suicidal thoughts compared to 9.4% of men. There's not much in it, but there, this matches other evidence that shows us that the pandemic's been harder for women. Women have had to juggle a lot of the time the homeschooling stuff at the start, managing childcare, looking after children and working at the same time. And I was one of those women as well. And that's really difficult, and men have had to do it also, but it seems that more women than men ended up doing this stuff because of the traditional gender roles, I guess. So women seem to be more affected than men. And even generally, you find that women have more suicidal thoughts than men. Men are more likely to die by suicide. They don't tell us when they're feeling suicidal. So, it's the gender difference isn't that clear cut, and we need to provide support to both men and women. Access to outside space is another one. There's all sorts of really interesting things coming out of this, and access to outside space is a big one. And the orange group is the no. So people who've had no access to outside space are really disadvantaged by this pandemic. And that has actually got bigger. The gap there has got bigger as we move through the different waves of the pandemic. I think in winter it's going to get bigger still. So we need to find ways of allowing people to access outdoor space, because those are the people who are more likely to feel suicidal. It's associated, of course, with poverty and deprivation and inequality and all of those things which we know very, very clearly are amplified by this pandemic. Loneliness is another really interesting one. We traditionally think that older people are more prone to loneliness than young people. But yet in this study, and we've swapped around the colours just to add a bit of excitement there for you, but that top line, that orange line, in this case is our younger age groups, the 18 to 29 years and more, feeling more lonely than the 30 to 59 and 60 plus age group are feeling. Now, maybe that's a reflection of existing levels of loneliness before the pandemic, because this is a question about change and loneliness as a result of the pandemic. But nonetheless, I think it's very, very interesting that our young people are affected more by the change there too. So here is my my argument about the pandemic, what way I see the pandemic as a psychologist. The pandemic is a threat, and it's a legitimate threat. I would have been saying at the start, if you're not scared, there's something wrong. This is a scary time to be in, and our body and brain respond in a particular way to stress and to these sorts of threats. And it means that our body and brain is working properly when we have these symptoms of stress, the fight or flight symptoms. And it's the body's way of preparing us to fight or run away from an aggressor. So this system that we're dealing with, this animal brain that we have, has evolved to fight wild animals to ensure that we survive in a very, very different type of world. And we all have this to an extent. And if we perceive fear or threat, or if there's something after us, our body goes into fight or flight mode, which means that the focus is on the core functions, things like our immune system put to the side, digestion. We can get diarrhea, the body just dumps everything that's in there so it can run away. Our muscles are impacted, our breathing, our heart rate. Over time, this is not good if we have this again and again and again, because it puts pressure on our digestive system, puts pressure on our heart and our circulation. But from time to time, having this stress response is not going to damage us. It makes us know we're alive. It prepares us for the danger that's ahead. So it's by and large a good thing. And that's what we're getting. And that's what I had in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, not being able to focus, normal effects of stress. And stress affects our ability to think. So if you can imagine, the body's primed to, fight or to be ready for that attack coming around the corner. So we shouldn't be focusing on activities. We shouldn't be concentrating. We should be always that wee bit on edge, because that helps us work out whenever the attacker's coming. But we have difficulty remembering things, and it's very, very difficult for us to focus. It's only natural we'd feel a bit threatened and irritable and have trouble relaxing. Again, we don't want to relax too much when we're in this state because it doesn't serve us. In terms of our physical health, we could have an increase in energy and be in high alert all the time. And that's kind of the way I go. So we can't add any more caffeine or anything to that mix. It's really not good. Feeling restless, sweating a lot, easily startled. Hypervigilance is common in terms of this stress response. And we'll have difficulty sleeping because if we sleep, we'll get attacked. So all of these are, when you think of the way that they serve us, it's perfectly normal and natural. But it is not good whenever you're a single mother of a 3-year-old who needs you to be calm and to help co-regulate her and deal with her emotional responses to things that's going on in her life. So it's not a good state to be in for the longer term. In terms of our social functioning, we want to be alone because that's maybe the best place for us. We'll be working out who we need to blame right now for what's happened, because again, that's something that would serve us well, working out where the problem is, who's at fault. The world's very, very simple, and we will get into lots of arguments too. So all of these are the normal effects of stress, and you can see them. You only have to look at Facebook or Twitter every day of the week to see all of these problems manifest, and we get into all sorts of trouble as a result of them. But it's important that we're aware of this so that we can actually work out whether we're in a state of stress, and as leaders, whether we're acting from a state of fight or flight, of stress, because we won't make good decisions. We won't be able to lead, we won't be able to problem solve whenever we're in this state. As a lecturer, I was pretty rubbish. I look at those lectures and go, oh my goodness, they're just too emotional. There's oversharing. Everything the lecturers shouldn't do it's in there. So this is not a good place to be if we're trying to lead a community or a family or a classroom through a difficult time. So we need to be aware of when we're here and get ourselves back out of it again, so that we can do our jobs. So I use this slide to explain kind of what's happening here, and I call it the circuits of survival. So at the top, we have safe and social, or productive and creative. What's the other word? Rest and digest, where we're in a calm state. And like as leaders, that's where we need to be in order to problem solve, because that's where innovation happens. That's where the compassion happens. That's where we can be the best leaders for our community and for our family. It's where we're calm, engaged, connected. We can see other people's perspectives because we can give them the time. We can be empathic. We can be hopeful. We can be joyous in this state. Very difficult to be joyous when you're in a state of fight or flight. Now, whenever there's a danger, we drop into fight or flight. We're mobilized, we're vigilant, we are aggressive, avoidant, stressed, shouting, running, anger, all of those things normal serve us well. And that perception of danger can even be like somatic. It's a kind of an internal thing where we have a sense of danger, or we see something or smell something or somebody says something that triggers us. That's where the word trigger comes from. It triggers us, and it can be completely subconscious. We mightn't be even aware of what it is that's triggered us. But as leaders, I think we need to start understanding these processes and how they work for us so that we can catch them, put ourselves back up into safe and social in order to do our jobs well. The third stage here is shutdown, and this is where we've had a significant loss that overwhelms us, and this is what happens when we have a trauma. So stress is normal. Fight or flight is absolutely normal. We'll go into it a few times every day. There'll be that kind of, oh, we're getting too close to the car in front of us, slam on the brakes, or so it happens all the time when we're driving, when we're doing online seminars, is the internet dropping, as somebody's trying to, there all of that stuff. So we're constantly moving between those. Shutdown is different. Shutdown is where we're totally overwhelmed, and that's the freeze response, the disconnected. A lot of stress can plunge us into shutdown. And sometimes kids that have been traumatized are in kind of shut down all the time. They can never really connect. They're not even in that fight or flight where they're running about and, highly, highly stressed. And this is a stage where we can feel suicidal, and loss can bring us there. And when we're in shutdown, we're really no good. We're kind of broken in a wee way. We need to start to heal before we can help other people. So when we've had a huge loss, we need to go through that grieving process to bring us out of shutdown, and know that that shutdown is normal. It's like a physical injury. It's a psychological injury. Um, the important point is that if we go through all these stages too often, we can actually recalibrate the thresholds for each stage. So we go into fight or flight more easily. So if we've been reared in a family where everybody's angry and aggressive and we're getting maybe hit a lot and there's violence, we go into fight or flight kind of nearly all the time. And that's a really difficult situation for a child because they can't learn. So the recalibration happens if there's repeated trauma, if there's repeated stress. And that's really the whole trauma-informed approach, is understanding how each of these states relate to what has happened to people, particularly in childhood. So this little slide represents us in Northern Ireland and Derry and District and Strabane, all of our local areas. We're a social species. And we've been asked to say separated at the minute. It's really, really hard. But we also have this thing called neuroception, where those subconscious cues that trigger changes are influenced by what we see in other people. So we're attuned to the state of other mammals. So the one little meerkat senses danger, all the other meerkats know. They look at that and they go, oh, something's wrong. So my 3-year-old knew, absolutely knew, whenever I was highly stressed as a result of the COVID thing. So we're tuned into the state of other mammals, and we mirror their survival states from everybody in the herd. If one animal senses danger, we'll all be in high alert. We won't even know why, but it will be transmitted. It can be transmitted over Zoom. It can be transmitted down the lead. If you're walking a dog, the dog will know whenever you're anxious. It'll know subconsciously, right? So in order to be good leaders, we need to be calm leaders. We need to lead from a place of safe and social. And if we can be calm and safe, if we can be calm and in that safe and social space, that's also contagious, and particularly so if you're a leader. The power of a leader who's in that place is just, it's unimaginable. And you can see it whenever you hear people like Nicola Sturgeon. You see her address, as Jacinta Ardern was the same. Calm, regulated, all of those things, and you just get a sense of safety there. So what I'm urging you to do, more than anything else, one message to take away from this is look after your own mental health. Make sure that you're leading from a place of safe and social, and you will, just by your very presence, have an impact on everybody else in your pack. And that is so powerful. So self-care must absolutely come first, because if you're in that state of stress, then everybody else is going to pick that up. And we know whenever we're all stressed out, particularly a pandemic, what do? We go out and buy toilet roll, we go clean mad in social media, and we blame everybody, and it's just not helpful. And then people don't wear masks and the whole thing gets worse. So, we need to be calm here. So what can we do to take care of ourselves? Well, one of the main messages from all of this is that stress is a normal response. Anxiety is a very, very normal response to a completely abnormal situation. So you must practice radical self-care and radical self-kindness and radical self-compassion right now, because all of the things that you've done that you mightn't be proud of, the things that you've said, the arguments that we've all done, because this is just a really hard time for all of us. We haven't been our best selves during this at all. It's a normal response. It's okay. Get over it. Now we know what's happening. We're in a more sort of stable phase. We're going to have this for a while, so we need to get used to it. So we need to seek support, though. We need to, if we can't do it ourselves, if we find we're struggling to get up there, that we're constantly on edge, seek support. Use creative methods. The Mind in Your Head website is really, really good. The COVID NI website is really good. There's so much there. All of you have access to the internet to some degree if you're on this call. So use what we have, this great gift that other populations have not had through a pandemic, and many parts of the world don't have this. So use that. And then if there's opportunities for face-to-face connections where you can get support, do that if you can do it safely, obviously. Practice gratitude and promote hope. You can literally rewire your brain to be more hopeful and to be more grateful, and that will bring you back into safe and social like nothing else. I have my one line a day diary that I fill in every day, just stuff that I'm enjoying with my child. It's my cousin got it to me, a mother's diary, and I thought this is a bit twee here, but it's been brilliant. Do something every day, even if you just put a screensaver on your phone of the people that matter to you, and the things that you're grateful for, or your pets, whatever it is that gives your life meaning. You must keep reminding yourself of that. Those are your core values. And that's what you need to return to when you're trying to make difficult decisions. And when you're in a flux, you need to remind yourself of what matters to you. So gratitude and hope. We do have a lot to be hopeful for. No pandemic has lasted forever. So what are we hopeful for? What are the things that we're looking forward to in the next few years? And what are we going to look back on and say that we did to get through this? So written, visual activities, anything, just photographs, whatever it takes, just reprogram your environment's very, very powerful right now. So get the pictures up, get the screensavers up to remind you of what it's all about for you and what you're going to look forward to at the other end of this. Control your exposure to the media and the news, and particularly social media and all the negative stuff about who's to blame and who's right and who's wrong and all of that. You will not be an expert in COVID and viral transmission and human behavior and everything else. It's just not possible. Look to scientific consensus. SAGE and anti-SAGE are where it's at for me right now. And so to look for that consensus when you're thinking about what you want to do and how you're going to live your best life through all of this. Think about your small manageable goals, and make them part of larger goals that align with your core values. Write out your core values so that you remember them, and think about, what do you want to do that helps promote those that makes sense in relation to your core values. And you find then very quickly that you stop arguing with your family, that you stop panic buying from the next directory, as I did, that you don't pour that extra glass of wine on a Saturday night, because you're reminded about what's really important, and you're moving yourself right back up into safe and social all the time. Move your body. The stress response is a response that's designed to make you move. So use it, and get out there. It's a great distraction. It completely gets rid of all that stuff. When you move your body as if you fought the animal, your brain starts to think this, okay, yeah, job done. Right, we can get back to normal. It's so powerful. It doesn't have to be going for a run. It can be anything. I like to go for a run, but you can just gentle movement, repetitive sensory actions. If you're really struggling, think about how you would comfort a wee baby. Give yourself a hug. Use soft textures. Music, singing is really powerful as well. Do things that give you pleasure, that can bring you back up into that state, and treat yourself as if you were a wee baby that you're trying to nurture away from a state of stress. Okay, we're nearly done now, sorry. Okay, so what might make things worse? There are high risk activities that we all engage in whenever we're under stress. So we're going to spend more money, maybe buy stupid things like tin soup and toilet roll, and gamble. Lots of people are doing that. So be kind to yourself if that's you. Alcohol, smoking, drugs. Remember, you were in a place of stress, but now you know a wee bit better. So just have a look at how that's serving you and how it fits with your core values. Constantly worrying about COVID is not going to help either. And that's different from preparing. Preparing is actually really helpful. So I would say what we should all have now is a self-isolation plan. Who's going to look after the kids? How are you going to get food into the house? What are you going to tell work? How are you going to work from home? Do you need anything right now? Set it up, make a self-isolation safety plan. So that you know what's going to happen, because it's going to be the case for a lot of us that we have to do this. And then get over it and think about something else and do something that aligns with your goals and your core values. Co-ruminating is just the worst. We're telling people to connect, and what they're doing is sitting having conversations for hours about how bad everything is and how everybody's let everybody else down and nobody's doing the right thing and nobody knows it's just not helpful. So do not co-ruminate. Have positive, joyous conversations that are hopeful about planning what we're going to do whenever we're at the other end of this, please. So, how do we maximize our capacity to cope? Well, we need healthy, strong bodies to be leaders, to be in that safe and social place. If you think if we're starving ourselves, or if we're constantly kind of going around half hungover and exhausted because we're not sleeping, and this is not a good state from which to lead. So, healthy food and physical activity, really important to keep our bodies healthy. And if we do get infected with the virus, that will serve us well as well. Accept those unhelpful emotions and refocus on activities that are aligned with our core values. Maintain our daily routines and structures. Think about the positive coping behaviors that worked in the past. What did we do first time around? Because we need to try and recreate that. But maybe not with so much alcohol and fatty food, possibly. And try and restructure this and make, if there's any good that you can get out of this, if there's anything positive you can do, please try and do it. If it's about fostering deeper connections with your family, which it was for me, really making the most of the time I had with my wee toddler, that's not time you'll get back either. So if you're lucky enough to have that, try and enjoy the time you've got with your family at this stage, because we'll be back to the madness and the rat race soon enough, I would say. Um, so try and restructure how we think about it. Yes, it's a terrible time, but it's a difficult time that most of us will be able to get through. And most of us, and certainly on this call, I would say most of us have various blessings that mean we're not going to lose everything, in terms of our livelihoods and our physical health and everything. So we should be okay. The last slide. So what do we need from leaders? Just to summarize everything. We need our leaders to be role models of self-care and self-compassion. So I'm all for the sort of vulnerability. It's okay to say that we're struggling, and that it's difficult to cope right now. That's okay. But we also need to role model self-care and self-compassion before we can start to help other people. So I would call it selective, authentic vulnerability. It's okay to be vulnerable, but we don't want our leaders to be too vulnerable. So we need to lead from that place of safe and social, acknowledging that there's pressure. But if we're in a state of fight or flight, or if we've had that bereavement or trauma, then we need to take a wee step back and manage that before we can be effective leaders. We need to be putting out there information that we can trust. We don't want to be spreaders of misinformation or, God forbid, harmful information. So just be very careful about what you're sharing if you're in a position of power like that. It's important that we're as accessible as we can do, and that as we can be, and that we give attention and empathy to the people that we work with, particularly if we're bosses, dealing with employees and staff who have so many different struggles. So it's important to validate people's concerns before we start to problem solve. And then we need to problem solve, and we can only do that when we're in the right place psychologically. Finally, we need to be flexible, and our flexibility has all been tested, but look at how well we've adapted. If you'd said even a few months ago that we could have events like this, where we have groups of people talking about this stuff online, you would have said it wouldn't work. It's not possible. We are really, really flexible and really resilient. So we need to just draw on that and use that, and keep working with that flexibility and making sure that we stay connected to the people that we're looking after as well, if we're in the right place to do that.